We're going to be here with Jay Shockley today to hear about Homos, Lezzies, and Undesirable gay bar raids and the closures in New York City. So it's, as we celebrate Pride this month, it's appropriate to look at our history and the history of what Stonewall was and why it happened, and the forces of oppression and social control pre and post Stonewall. And Jay will be using place-based history that are on our sites, on our website, to discuss that. As mentioned, we're the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project. We're a cultural heritage initiative and educational resource documenting LGBTQ place-based history in the city from the 17th century to the year 2000. This month, we've celebrated with 400 fully documented sites that are on our website. Each entry is categorized, and you can see on the right, by building type. And on the left is a filtered map. This is from our main homepage. You could sort by cultural significance, neighborhood era, and so forth. The sites tell the story of LGBTQ history that's self-referential, such as Stonewall, as well as the community's influence on American culture through sites such as performance venues, places of architecture, residences of individuals where works of literature were written, and so forth. And it's a wonderful way to dive into learning about this history in New York City, where, as you can see from the map, we've created basically a cultural landscape of the LGBTQ past. As mentioned, we like to use our website and the sites we've researched to connect people to the past and events. This is an example of James Baldwin, and this is on our website. We have 6 specific sites associated with Baldwin. So you could look at Baldwin's life through the lens of buildings in New York City. We also have around 250 additional sites on our website, but on our main database that we're researching and adding, and that will expand our list, and it's an ongoing growing project. Excuse me. To make it a little easier for people to digest what we have on our website through the map, we've created themes. There are a total of 33 that are existing right now, and this is just a smidgen of them. You can see from the Harlem Renaissance, communities of color, activism before Stonewall, and various other topics. But this makes it a little easier for you to go in and dive into the sites and have some type of thematic approach. The project started in 2015 to increase diversity on the National Register of Historic Places. At the time, there were only 2 sites in the United States listed specifically for LGBTQ history. Today, there are 23. This is some of the sites we've done in New York City. New York City, I'm proud to say, leads the way. What's not included here is the most recent one, which was Lillian Wald at the Henry Street settlement. Getting sites listed on the National Register forever memorializes them as American history, and that's something that we really feel is important to emphasize with our project. While we're making this invisible history visible, we're memorializing it for the public record. We've also advocated for local New York City landmark designations. Before the project officially started, we advocated for Stonewall, and then recently in 2019, these 6 others were designated individual city landmarks by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. And like any other project nowadays, we really emphasize, please follow us on social media. It's another tool for people to understand our content and have a more passive way of experiencing LGBT place-based history. You can go to our website, which is listed above that, or you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and we now have a YouTube page where this presentation is being recorded will appear. So I'm going to hand it over to Jay and switch to another screen. Yep, and make this more sort of usable for Jay. So Jay, and also just from a technical point of view, use the cursor here to advance. Yeah. So.
Thanks, Ken, and welcome everybody and happy Pride. I'd like to start out by just, in light of all the current attacks on all facets of our community, increasingly all across the United States, I think it's instructive that we look back at some of the things faced in New York City over the previous 175 years. So this talk is a partial narrative from the 1840s to almost the present, based almost exclusively, as Ken indicated, on existing sites that we have documented at the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project so far. It includes a variety of attacks on our community, some of the raids, attempts and successes at closing down LGBT spaces, and some of the early resistance. The history of the LGBT community in the city in the 19th and 20th centuries was one in which there was constant harassment, oppression, discrimination, bias, censorship, and social control. The combined forces of the police, government, organized religion, moral crusaders, censors, criminals, psychiatric professionals, and families asserted themselves in different manners. During this period, bars evolved as the few relatively safe space havens for gay men and later for lesbians. After Prohibition, however, there was the added factor of the mafia's heavy presence in this arena. By the 1960s, gay bars were crucial to creating a sense of community and cultivating political action that helped to advance the movement for gay rights. As early as 1842, an emerging homosexual subculture was being noticed in the rapidly expanding city in places like saloons, music halls, and parks. Historian Jonathan Ned Katz found, quote, the earliest known American crusade against sodomites by New York's macho sporting press, which advocated heterosexual males' lifestyles, including patronizing female prostitutes. The word sodomites, remember that the earliest use of the term homosexual wasn't until 50 years later, were attacked and stereotyped as older upper-class foreign men. City Hall Park and adjacent Broadway to the left in this print was identified as the principal location where young working-class men could be found as prostitutes at the time. The earliest known extant building that could now be considered a gay bar was Pfaff's in the cellar of the Coleman House Hotel in 1859 to 64. It became a favorite bohemian haunt, famously including the patronage of Walt Whitman in 1859 to 62, during which he wrote his famously homoerotic Calamus poems that were included in the 1860 edition of Leaves of Grass. A portion of Pfaff's was also known as a place for men looking to meet other men. In his pioneering book, Gay New York, and I don't know if Mr. George Chauncey has joined us, he was signed up to, so I hope he is. George Chauncey identified the 1890s as a period when one very specific aspect of the gay male community, the subculture of flamboyantly effeminate so-called fairies, became noticed by a wider public. Upper middle class men were attracted downtown to witness the so-called depravity of the lower classes and thus be scandalized or to participate. The slide in this row house basement was popularly identified by 1890 as, quote, New York's worst dive because of its fairies. A slide in prostitutes' jargon at the time was, quote, an establishment where male homosexuals dressed as women and solicited men. Newspapers purporting to defend public morality spotlighted the most sensational aspect of this underworld. The slide was closed by police in 1892, and the proprietor was convicted of keeping a disorderly house. As with the slide, the nearby Black Rabbit was subject to frequent police raids. It was closed in 1899, but reopened, and then was personally raided in 1900 by the infamous Anthony Comstock of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. Comstock was a self-appointed vigilante regulator of morality who got his start in 1872 under the auspices of the YMCA and founded the society 2 years later. Among his obsessions were prostitution, erotica, abortion, contraception, and homosexuality, writing that, in quotes, inverts, i.e. homosexuals, are not fit to live with the rest of mankind. They ought to have branded in their foreheads the word unclean, instead of the law making 20 years imprisonment the penalty for their crime. It ought to be imprisonment for life. Police activity soon spread to other locations as well. Chauncey found that raids by the Society for the Suppression of Vice in 1919 to 1920 produced the arrests of numerous gay men at the very popular Everard Baths, which had opened in 1888. And as early as 1921, police were sent into Central Park to entrap and arrest gay men, including in mass sweeps. Then in 1923, New York State revised its statutes to include, for the first time, homosexual solicitation in the city, charging any solicitation for, quote, a crime against nature or other lewdness as, quote, degenerate, disorderly conduct. Courts came to widely interpret this to even ban public assembly by homosexuals. This was soon followed by an attack at the depiction of gay people on the Broadway stage. God of Vengeance was a Yiddish play by Sholem Asch that told the story of a Jewish brothel owner whose daughter has a lesbian relationship with one of his prostitutes. Opened in Berlin in 1907, it was performed successfully in a dozen languages in Europe, as well as in an English language version in 1922 in Greenwich Village. When it was performed in an altered version in 1923 at the Apollo Theater on 42nd Street, with the first lesbian love scene depicted on Broadway, reaction from moralists in the city was swift. The Society for the Suppression of Vice lodged a complaint, and a grand jury, convened in secret, indicted the entire cast and producer for, quote, presenting an obscene, indecent, immoral, and impure theatrical production, and they were arrested. The acclaimed lead actor and producer were convicted on charges of obscenity. This was the first conviction of a theater performer for immorality by an American jury. Though the Court of Appeals eventually overturned the conviction, in 1927, the New York legislature passed the Wales Padlock Law, which made it illegal, in quotes, depicting or dealing with the subject of sex degeneracy or sex perversion. Offending theaters could be closed, and the law remained on the books until 1967. During the 1920s, as the visibility of gay men, lesbians, and bisexuals increased in Greenwich Village, New York's earliest LGBT neighborhood, and women started to obtain greater autonomy, police harassment was a constant threat. Raids in 1924-25 closed a number of establishments and forced some to relocate. Eve's Hangout was a popular club run in 1924-26 by a Polish-Jewish lesbian emigre who used the name Eve Adams. Police raided the club in 1926 and she was arrested. She was convicted of obscenity for Lesbian Love, a collection of her short stories, as well as disorderly conduct for alleged solicitation of a policewoman. This was an early and quite extraordinary instance of a woman convicted of same-sex solicitation. She was deported and during World War II was tragically murdered at Auschwitz. You can go on our YouTube channel, and we did a book talk with Jonathan Ed Katz, who did some really pioneering research on Eve Adams. Stewart's Cafeteria, opened in 1933, became a very popular hangout and a place where LGBT life was publicly on display rather than covert through its wide expanse of plate glass windows. It highlights the village's role at the time as both LGBT haven and tourism magnet. Patrons and tourists embraced the spectacle, with crowds outside peering at the, quote, dykes, fags, pansies, and lesbians, as one voyeur described the scene. Gay artist Paul Cadmus depicted Stewart's in his painting Greenwich Village Cafeteria of 1934. The manager, however, was convicted in 1935 of operating a public nuisance and a disorderly house and, quote, openly outraging public decency. The Manhattan District Attorney's complaint cited that the cafeteria was, quote, used as a rendezvous for perverts, degenerates, homosexuals, and other ill-disposed persons. But much of the court testimony actually centered on the gender nonconformity of the patrons. Sorry. After Prohibition, which lasted from 1920 to 1933, the State Liquor Authority, which I'll refer to as the SLA, in 1934 was granted the power to revoke the licenses of bar owners, sorry, who, quote, suffer or permit their premises to become disorderly. Though state legislators declined to further define the word disorderly, the SLA, prodded by moral reformers, and the existence of the 1923 state statute, considered the mere presence of gay people at a bar to be so defined. The mafia, seizing another opportunity for exploitation and profit, opened some establishments under the ruse of being members-only bottle clubs that didn't need a license. But with the creation of the SLA, virtually all gay and lesbian bars came to be owned and or controlled by the mafia, and a vicious cycle began of mafia police SLA payoffs in Manhattan and Brooklyn. Bar owners were forced to take out mafia loans and patronize their monopoly on bar equipment and vending machines. Ironically, through these bribes and payoffs, the police and SLA authorities actually protected mafia interests and kept many gay bars open. One of the first known gay bars to lose its license under the SLA was Gloria Bar and Grill, which has been demolished. It was closed as part of the SLA's cleanup citywide in preparation for the 1939 World's Fair. The bar may have been targeted since, like Stewart's, it had extensive plate glass windows, making its patrons highly visible. The SLA charged that the bar allowed, in the homophobic language of the agency, quote, homosexuals, degenerates, and other undesirable people to congregate on the premises. The owners actually contested the charges, but lost in court. Tony Pastor's Downtown, which opened in 1939, had a mixed clientele of lesbians, tourists, and some gay men, and featured shows of what were then known as female impersonators. Raided on morals charges in 1944 for permitting lesbians to, in quotes, loiter on the premises, Pastor survived due to its mob backing. But the SLA finally revoked its liquor license in 1967 because it, quote, permitted homosexuals, degenerates, and undesirables to conduct themselves in an offensive and indecent manner. From 1945 to 1951, the popular mafia-controlled Club 181, which was in the basement of this former Yiddish theater building, was called the homosexual Copacabana because it was one of the most luxurious American clubs that featured lavish shows of female impersonators and drag king waitstaff and performers. It was operated by Anna Genovese, the bisexual wife of the infamous Vito Genovese, who is one of the biggest mafia club bosses in the village since the 1930s. The club, however, lost its liquor license through an action of the SLA in 1951 after the club, its performers, staff, and patrons were surveilled by undercover police. The club was cited for 9 violations, including the presence of homosexuals, lesbians, and other undesirables, and the club's allegedly obscene, indecent performances. In its reporting, the New York Daily News called the club, quote, a hangout for perverts of both sexes. Club 181 was extremely profitable, however, with a substantially straight outer borough and tourist crowd, and receipts for 1950 were reported as nearly $500,000. I discovered that the mafia actually contested the revocation of its license, and really interestingly, the club attempted to challenge the SLA's use of the term disorderly to revoke the licenses of places with an LGBT clientele, since it was so vague and the legislature had never defined it. The case went through 3 levels of New York courts, and the final appeal to the US Supreme Court was denied. The SLA counsel had stated, quote, "The operation of this club constituted an affront to the community and a danger to the morals of the citizenry." But once again, much of the police testimony centered on the gender nonconforming dress and behavior of the performers, staff, and patrons. The manager was actually forced to deny any knowledge that gay men or lesbians frequented the club or were employed there. George Chauncey also found a 1953 court decision that officially began to limit the SLA's power to revoke the liquor licenses of disorderly premises that gay men and lesbians frequented. This involved the Fifth Avenue bar and the Stanwood Cafeteria, located near the busy intersection of Broadway and West 72nd Street, which had opened around 1940. One of the largest establishments on the Upper West Side, with clear visibility from the street through large windows, its bar became popular, especially with working class gay men and so-called painted queens. In 1953, the SLA revoked the bar's license based on one plainclothes policeman's observations. He alleged that about 15 men were acting, quote, in a female way, some grabbing each other, in quotes, indecently, and accused one man of making an indecent proposal to him. The bar owners contested, and the court turned out to be leery of the SLA's action, given the excellent reputation of the cafeteria and the substantial financial investment it represented, and it rebuked the SLA on inadequate evidence. Its decision in Stanwood United versus O'Connell officially limited the SLA's definition of an, in quotes, disorderly bar. In the future, the SLA was required to prove that the gay men or lesbians present in a bar had actually engaged in conduct that was disorderly, not simply their presence, and that the establishment had acquiesced in that behavior. Though this court decision was cited in many subsequent cases, in reality, the SLA and the police mostly ignored it, and harassment of places attracting a gay clientele continued. As evidenced by the Sea Colony, originally opened as a restaurant around 1950, that became a lesbian hangout by at least 1955 and a destination for women to dance together. The Sea Colony was also mafia run and raided daily by the police throughout its existence into the 1960s. The bar was particularly popular for working class lesbians who mostly fit into a butch femme dynamic. The butches were especially a target of police brutality, as dressing in 3 articles of clothing associated with the perceived opposite sex was illegal in New York at the time, and women found dancing together could land them in jail. Other government agencies, including on the federal level, were also keeping watch. The FBI was surveilling the Music Box, open since 1950. In its 1955 to 56 report investigating, quote, notorious types and places of amusement in Greenwich Village, it stated that, quote, the majority of the bars and restaurants in this area cater to lesbians and homosexuals, quite a few of whom reside in the area and are not inhibited in the pursuit of their amorous conquests. There will also be found a segment of the tourist trade who go to the village to observe the lesbians and queers at play. This was not limited to Manhattan. The Heights Supper Club appears to have been one of the first bars in Brooklyn to cater to a gay male clientele. In operation since 1950, but failing, new owners in 1961 decided to appeal to the growing number of gay men who lived in or visited Brooklyn Heights. The club soon drew complaints from straight residents and became the target of police undercover operations. In 1963, the SLA revoked its license, finding that it was, quote, a notorious congregating place for homosexuals and degenerates. In this overwhelmingly repressive climate, the gay and lesbian community did start to organize. After the first two gay men's organizations in the city, the Veterans Benevolent Association of 1945 and the League of 1954, both of which we've just recently posted to our website, came the more activist and influential New York chapters of the Mattachine Society and Daughters of Elitists, formed in 1955 and 1958. Dick Leish, seen on the left, became president of Mattachine, New York in 1965 and led the group in a more militant direction, with its two top priorities becoming the end of police harassment of the police entrapment of gay men, which occurred in all sorts of public places, and police harassment of gay bars. Mattachine considered bars a critical issue because they were some of the few common public spaces where gay people could find and meet each other and were crucial to creating a sense of community. One significant effort by the gay community at that time to create a social space that was outside of the control of the mafia, SLA authority, and the police arrestments and entrapment was the formation in 1966 of the Corduroy Club. This was a private social club in a garment district loft founded by former Mattachine members that offered mostly older lesbians and gay men an alternative to the bar scene. By 1968, it had a membership of over 1,000 and also hosted a number of the early homophile organizations. Mattachine led one of the earliest and most significant planned public actions for American gay rights, inspired by the Black civil rights sit-ins in the South, the event that came to be known as the Sip-In on April 21st, 1966 at Julius's bar. Julius's was a mixed bar that attracted a gay clientele by the 1960s, despite the management's policy of non-encouragement. To spotlight the SLA's discriminatory policy, Mattachine members were photographed being refused service after stating they were homosexuals. Julius's had been surveilled by a policeman in November of the previous year, and its license was suspended by the SLA, but it was on appeal when the sip-in took place. This event, which was also covered in the press, attracted public support and the attention of the New York City Commission on Human Rights, causing the SLA to publicly disavow its policy. The appellate court reinstated Julius's license in 1967. But as the events around Stonewall starting on Saturday, June 28, 1969 show, the pattern of harassment of gay bars continued. This mafia-run sign-in club was particularly popular with a younger crowd and was one of the few that allowed dancing. During this totally routine raid, the reaction of the patrons, street youth, and neighborhood residents was anything but typical or expected, and instead of dispersing, an angry crowd fought back. The demonstrations and conflicts with police over the course of 6 days, with up to several thousand people at its peak, marked a major change and inspired immediately a more activist phase of the LGBT civil rights movement. Another critical, if lesser known event occurred in March 1970, less than a year after Stonewall. The police raided the after-hours basement bar, the Snake Pit. They detained 167 men, but fearing another street confrontation, hauled them to the local police station. Diego Vinales, a young immigrant fearing deportation, attempted to escape by jumping out of a window, but was impaled on an iron fence below. Several detainees were able to telephone members of the recently formed Gay Activist Alliance and the press. Appalled at his possible death, Diego actually did survive. GAA quickly assembled a large protest march with the Gay Liberation Front from the Stonewall to the police station, as well as a candlelight vigil at St. Vincent's Hospital where he was taken. Handmade flyers read, "Any way you look at it, that boy was pushed. We are all being pushed." This protest, which received media coverage, demonstrated the strength of these early gay rights organizations and inspired many more LGBT people to become more politically active. Lesbians also held a number of public protests in 1970 and 71 against the constant harassment and exploitative policies of the mafia-run bar Cookies, which had opened in 1965. Another lesbian bar, the Duchess, opened in 1972 and was racially and economically diverse. But by 1980, it ran into legal trouble for not serving alcohol to men, an act of perceived discrimination by the city that led to the bar losing its liquor license. It continued to serve liquor, however, until 1982, when the bartender and bouncer were arrested by undercover police. Ironically, the anti-discrimination law for which the Duchess's license was revoked was one championed by many of the movement women in an earlier era. And finally, in closing, to show that these issues, even in New York, are not in the distant past, is La Escuelita, which is one of the very newest entries on our website. Opened in the late 1970s in Hell's Kitchen, it was one of the city's leading LGBT Latin clubs, a longtime gathering place of refuge for the Latino and Black communities, and known for its drag shows. Subject to constant surveillance by the police, the SLA declined to renew its license in 2012, and the club closed in 2016. So thank you for your attention, and we will open it up to questions.
Over here. While you're thinking of any questions that you have to ask, I think it's important to note that the mafia was involved in every aspect of bar culture, whether it be the jukeboxes, the cigarette machines, whether they were, not necessarily owning the building, but controlling the space to some degree. Some were mafia controlled and owned bars, while others were legitimate business owners who had to pay off the mob. But somehow the mafia was always involved.
You want to bring the whole crowd back on?
So I'm just saying we have got about 36 people. If there's any questions, thoughts, suggestions, I mean, I know this is all sort of looking at history, but it's very chilling considering what's going on in the country today. And as someone said, the GOP platform, which is coming out of Texas, this past week, is very hair-raising.
I mean, it could absolutely be written from Anthony Comstock's Obsession.
Right.
Jay, Ken, and Andrew, you talk about a lot of bars that are now closed. Can you tell us about any spaces that are still in the city that are open, where people can still find LGBTQ community that also are historic?
That are historic LGBT spaces or just gay bars? Fortunately or unfortunately, I think there are 3 lesbian only specific bars in the city. 2 are in Greenwich Village and 1 is in Brooklyn. And there are, I think, I'm not sure what the count is, but a lot more bars catering to men. And then there are bars, I know that there are bars in Brooklyn, for example, on Fifth Avenue, I'm forgetting the name, who are more just queer bars, where it's a bar that happens to have a lot of queer people, and it's more of a sort of fluid association of as a safe space. But there are,
But if the question was historic spaces, obviously Julius is the single most historic interior, and even though Stonewall is very important, the interior of that bar, which is not in any way, shape, or form associated with the original Stonewall bar, it's in the same building, but it's not the same business, and there's nothing left of the interior if people get confused about that.
And speaking of Julius's, there was a recent celebratory event that took place there. Maybe you want to share that with folks.
Well, we were very pleased to put a plaque on the building acknowledging its history and in connection to the SIPN, as well as us getting it listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So that was quite fun. And then
that actually was our very first project success. We achieved getting it listed on the National Register of Historic Places a day or two prior to the 50th anniversary of the SIPN. So that was a real achievement of our brand new project.
Someone in the chat mentioned if I was thinking of Gingers. No, I'm not thinking of Gingers. It's another in Brooklyn on Fifth Avenue. It's another bar like on 14th Street that is Judy or something. I'm forgetting the name, but it was written about in some magazine or newspaper recently. Good Judy's, that's it. Thank you. I was going to say Just Judy, but I didn't want to meld that with Judge Judy, which is a whole different type of thing. And
it's one of the questions I'm not comparing with San Francisco. What was really interesting when this isn't specifically San Francisco, but when we first founded our project, we happened to go down to Washington, D.C., and some gay folks down there were giving a walking tour. And Washington, D.C., for instance, had zero mafia involvement in their bar scene ever, which was really eye-opening because it's just the dominant theme in New York City. So do we know from Shane if San Francisco had any?
I'm not sure about the mafia, no, in San Francisco.
Andrew, do you by any chance know?
No, I have no idea.
It wouldn't surprise me if there was some, given the population of San Francisco, but
it was also, the number of bars in Greenwich Village, and Greenwich Village had a large immigrant population, many Italian. So hence, like Anna Genovese getting involved after her husband Vito, was incarcerated and so forth. So she sort of saw the opportunity to be very involved in a number of establishments. I think what's also interesting is the surveillance of gay people in these bars and the entrapment. Jay mentioned that directly. There were undercover officers that would go into bars and oftentimes chat up a guy sitting at a bar or follow them out, and that person would ask to come back to someone's apartment, and that was solicitation and arrest. And that's what happened at Julius's in November of 1965. Someone was arrested after being told by the bartender, please don't speak to this person, sort of met him outside and then back in the bar with him, and then he was arrested. So the bar lost had the threat of losing its license, and that's what they were going into court in April of '66, and the Mattachine Society knew about that as well.
One of the interesting things that I've always been really entertained by is that these police officers would dress in a way that they thought was the way that gay men dress. And a number of times I found descriptions that specifically said that they wore sweaters, as if wearing a sweater was like a gay identifier.
I think one of the
that's it with all of my crew neck sweaters. That's a giveaway for me, right?
Maybe they have to be cashmere and pink, right?
And fluffy.
The other thing about the court records, Jay mentioned what happened at Stewart's, at Julius's as well. When you see the undercover police officer in court testifying, how he describes how he could tell that there were homosexuals in the bar was about the way they held the cigarette, the way they walked, talked, and terribly stereotypic and homophobic commentary. And speaking of what Andrew said, I would love to research the individuals who were in the court cases as the undercover officers to find out what happened to them. The woman who entrapped basically Eve Adams is included in Jonathan's book, and she lived a long life, and they have a photo of her somehow in, I believe it's in Queens. She lived in Queens and went on to have a successful career in the police department. We are doing an in-person event on July 2nd at Jefferson Market Library on Hugh Ryan's new book, The Women's House of Detention, which is about the former Art Deco building that was on the current Jefferson Market Garden from 1929 to 1974. And Amanda Davis, our project manager, who's not here today, she's on vacation, will be with Hugh Ryan, who will be discussing this book, which really discusses the period of incarceration for so many queer women, gender nonconforming women, and that prison at the intersection of gay life, queer life in Greenwich Village during that period. And then if you want, you can sign up and receive emails about events that we're having. And probably a number of you already are on that list, but coming through the summer and fall, we'll be having additional events. And hopefully Andrew and I will be leading a walking tour tomorrow night in Greenwich Village that won't get rained out.
And we still have some space. So if you're interested
Right.
in starting at Washington Square, we'll actually be looking at a few of the sites that Jay talked about tonight.
Yeah, and it's a fundraiser for our event, for our project. I'll just mention that we are a little initiative that could, and we raise money through foundations, corporations, and individuals. So individual giving is always welcome and really sends a message to the public that LGBTQ history is important and is American history.
And just one little plug for their tour tomorrow. I mean, Ken and I gave one last week. We never cease getting comments from people, particularly because the biggest thing that our project contributes is gay history through the lens of all these sites that you can still see. And people that aren't that familiar with Greenwich Village are just bowled over at the geographic proximity of all these important sites, which is really quite interesting and thrilling. And so I would definitely, if you haven't signed up for their tour tomorrow, do so right now.
Galoshes welcome. So, well, thanks everybody. If there are no questions, thanks for coming and participating and allowing us to indulge you with this really important history that's more relevant and compelling today than it was yesterday, unfortunately. Have a great Pride. Take care.
Night.